The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering behind the metal barriers. Among them stood 8-year-old Emma Martinez, her small hand gripped tightly in her mother's palm. Emma had Down syndrome. Today was supposed to be the highlight of their London vacation. Sarah Martinez had saved for 2 years to bring her daughter to England. Emma had been fascinated by princesses and castles since she was tiny, spending hours watching royal documentaries and memorizing facts about the British monarchy. The trip was Sarah's way of showing Emma that dreams could come true. Even when the world sometimes seemed designed for others, the crowd pressed closer to the barriers as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Emma's eyes widened with wonder as she saw the tall, imposing figures in their iconic red tunics and bearskin hats marching into position. She had studied pictures of these guards for months, but seeing them in person was magical. "Mama, they're so tall," Emma whispered excitedly, her voice carrying the distinctive speech pattern that came with her condition. Her mother smiled, lifting Emma slightly so she could see better over the heads of other tourists. The guards took their positions with military precision, their movements synchronized and their faces stern beneath their towering hats. Emma watched in fascination as they stood motionless, like living statues guarding the Queen's home. She had read that these soldiers were trained never to move, never to smile, never to break character, no matter what happened around them. As the ceremony continued, Emma's excitement grew. She began to bounce slightly on her toes, a habit she had when she was particularly happy. Other tourists smiled at her obvious joy, but some also stared with the uncomfortable curiosity that Sarah had grown accustomed to over the years. "Can I go closer, Mama?" Emma asked, tugging at her mother's sleeve. The barriers seemed like such a small obstacle to a little girl who just wanted to get a better look at her heroes. Sarah hesitated. The barriers were there for a reason, and she didn't want to cause any trouble. But seeing Emma's face light up with such pure happiness made her want to make this moment as special as possible for her daughter. "We need to stay behind the line, sweetie," Sarah explained gently. "Those barriers keep everyone safe and help the guards do their job." Emma nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the nearest guard. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with a strong jawline visible beneath his bearskin hat. His name was James Wellington, though Emma didn't know that. What she did know was that he looked exactly like the brave soldiers in her storybooks. The crowd around them grew thicker as more tourists arrived. Emma found herself pushed further back, her view increasingly blocked by adults with cameras and phones. Her initial excitement began to fade as she struggled to see the guard she had traveled so far to witness. "I can't see any more, Mama," Emma said sadly, her voice barely audible over the chatter of the crowd. Sarah's heart broke a little. She had planned this trip so carefully, researching the best viewing spots and arriving early to secure a good position. But she hadn't anticipated how quickly the space would fill or how difficult it would be for Emma to maintain her view. A family with several tall teenagers pushed in front of them, completely blocking Emma's line of sight. The girl's shoulders slumped with disappointment. She had been so excited to take photos to show her classmates back home, to prove that she had really seen the famous guards of Buckingham Palace. "Maybe we can find a different spot," Sarah suggested. But looking around, she could see that every vantage point was packed with people. Moving would likely mean giving up their position entirely and potentially missing the ceremony. Altogether, Emma's bottom lip began to tremble, a sure sign that tears were not far behind. Sarah felt the familiar pang of helplessness that came with wanting to fix something for her daughter, but not knowing how. The guard James had noticed the commotion near the barrier. His training had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him while maintaining his stoic composure. He had seen the little girl with Down syndrome arrive with her mother, had witnessed her excitement and joy, and now observed her growing disappointment as she was pushed to the back of the crowd. Something stirred in James's chest, a feeling that went against everything he had been taught about maintaining his role. Guards were not supposed to acknowledge individual tourists. They were not supposed to show emotion or break character. Their job was to stand at attention and represent the dignity, a tradition of the British monarchy. But as he watched Emma's face fall with disappointment, James found himself thinking about his own little sister back home. Lucy was only 6, and she would have been just as excited as this little girl to see the guards. The thought of Lucy being disappointed in the same way made something inside James rebelled against his strict training. The ceremony continued around them, but for James, the moment seemed to slow down. He could see Emma standing on her tiptoes, craning her neck to try to catch a glimpse of the guards over the crowd. Her mother was doing her best to lift her higher, but Sarah was small herself and struggling with Emma's weight. Other tourists were completely absorbed in taking photos and videos, pushing forward to get better shots without regard for the small girl behind them. James watched as Emma finally gave up trying to see, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It was then that Emma did something unexpected. Instead of crying or asking her mother to leave, she began to wave at James, even though she could barely see him through the crowd. She had spotted his red tunic and was waving enthusiastically, her face brightening with hope. James felt his resolve wavering. The little girl's simple gesture of friendship touched something deep inside him. Here was a child who had traveled thousands of miles to see him and his fellow guards, who had studied and dreamed about this moment. And she was being denied the experience by circumstances beyond her control. The internal struggle was intense. Years of training told him to remain motionless, to ignore the interaction, but his humanity told him something different. As Emma continued to wave, her smile growing wider despite her disadvantaged position, James made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The moment had come for James to choose between following orders and following his heart. Emma's innocent wave hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and James found himself taking the first step toward a decision that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, compassion, and what it truly meant to serve. James Wellington had been a Queen's Guard for 3 years. Every morning, he polished his boots until they gleamed, pressed his red tunic until every crease was perfect, and practiced standing at attention for hours without moving a muscle. His commanding officers had drilled into him and every other guard that they were not entertainers or tourist attractions. They were soldiers with a sacred duty to protect the monarchy. The rules were crystal clear. No talking to tourists. No acknowledging cameras. No breaking character under any circumstances. James had seen other guards face serious consequences for even the smallest infractions. A smile at the wrong moment could result in disciplinary action. A wave or gesture could end a military career. But as Emma continued waving at him, her face glowing with hope, despite being pushed to the back of the crowd, James felt something crack inside his carefully constructed professional shell. The little girl wasn't asking for anything complicated. She just wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged, to feel like her dream of meeting a real royal guard was coming true. Emma's wave became more enthusiastic as she noticed James looking in her direction. She began jumping up and down, trying to make herself more visible over the crowd. Her mother, Sarah, was frantically trying to calm her daughter, while also attempting to get photos before the ceremony ended. Emma, honey, remember we talked about using our inside voice, Sarah whispered, embarrassed by the attention her daughter might be drawing. But Emma was beyond caring about social conventions. In her mind, she was communicating with a real-life knight, just like in her fairy tale books. James could see the exact moment when Emma realized she had been noticed. Her entire face transformed with joy, and she began signing something with her hands. James didn't understand sign language, but the message was clear. She was trying to say hello in every way she knew how. The crowd around, Emma continued to push forward, and she was now completely blocked from view except for brief moments when she managed to jump high enough to peek over someone's shoulder. Each time she appeared, she waved more desperately, as if afraid James would forget about her if she disappeared for too long. Sergeant Miller, James's superior, was conducting his routine patrol behind the guards. James knew that any unusual behavior would be spotted immediately. The sergeant had eyes like a hawk and zero tolerance for guards who let their emotions interfere with their duties. Despite the risk, James found himself subtly shifting his position. It was barely noticeable, just a slight turn of his head that allowed him to keep Emma in his peripheral vision. To outside observers, he still appeared perfectly stationary. But Emma seemed to sense that she had his attention. The little girl began to mouth words at him. James couldn't hear her over the crowd, but he could read her lips enough to understand she was saying, "Hello, soldier," over and over again. Her pronunciation wasn't perfect due to her Down syndrome, but her meaning was crystal clear. Sarah noticed her daughter's intense focus on one particular guard and followed. She saw James tall, young, and maintaining perfect military posture, but she also noticed something in his eyes that suggested he was more aware of Emma than regulations probably allowed. "Emma, sweetie, the guards can't talk while they're working," Sarah explained gently, trying to manage her daughter's expectations, but Emma shook her head firmly. "He sees me, Mama. Look, he's looking right at me," Emma insisted, bouncing on her toes again. Sarah looked more carefully and realized Emma might be right. There was something in the guard's positioning that seemed deliberately angled toward her daughter. It was subtle, probably invisible to most observers, but a mother's intuition told her that this young soldier was paying special attention to Emma. The ceremony was reaching its crescendo. The guards would soon begin their march back to their posts, and the crowd would disperse. Emma seemed to sense that her magical moment was about to end. Her waving became more frantic. It was then that disaster struck. A group of rowdy teenagers, eager to get the perfect selfie, pushed aggressively toward the barrier. Emma, being much smaller and less stable on her feet, was knocked off balance. She stumbled forward, her small body slipping between two adults, and suddenly finding herself on the wrong side of the barrier. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized what had happened. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw her daughter standing in the restricted area. Looking confused and frightened by the sudden change in her surroundings, security personnel immediately began moving toward Emma, their voices sharp with authority. "Miss, you need to get back behind the barrier immediately," one officer called out. But Emma, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and the stern voices, did what she always did. When she felt scared and confused, she froze. Her body went rigid, and she stood perfectly still in the middle of the restricted zone, her eyes wide with fear. "Emma," Sarah called out, trying to climb over the barrier to reach her daughter. But security held her back. The situation was escalating rapidly. More officers were converging on the scene, and Emma was beginning to show signs of severe anxiety. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She started making the small, whimpering sounds that Sarah recognized as the beginning of a panic. Attack? James watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He could see that Emma wasn't being defiant or mischievous. She was genuinely frightened and overwhelmed. The security officers, while doing their job, were making the situation worse with their loud voices and aggressive approach. Emma's panic attack was building. She began rocking back and forth, a self-soothing behavior that Sarah had seen countless times before. The little girl was retreating into herself, shutting down in the face of what felt like an impossible situation. "Please, she has Down syndrome," Sarah called out to the officers. "She's not trying to cause trouble, she's just scared." But the officers were focused on protocol. The restricted area had been breached, and their job was to restore order as quickly as possible. Regardless of the circumstances that led to the breach, James felt his training and his humanity pulling him in opposite directions. Every instinct told him to remain at his post, to let security handle the situation according to protocol. But looking at Emma, this brave little girl who had traveled so far just to wave at him, standing terrified and alone while adults shouted around her, James knew that following protocol wasn't always the same as doing what was right. The moment of decision had arrived. James could continue to stand at attention and watch as Emma's dream turned into a nightmare. Or he could risk his career to help a frightened child. The choice seemed impossible, but as Emma's panic attack intensified and her small body shook with fear, James realized there was really no choice at all. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his rifle strap. It was the smallest possible movement, but it was the beginning of the most important decision he would ever make as a Queen's Guard. The restricted area around Buckingham Palace had become a scene of controlled chaos. Emma stood frozen in the middle of the secured zone, her small body trembling as security officers surrounded her with increasing urgency. Their voices created a wall of sound that only made her panic worse. "Step back behind the barrier, miss," one officer commanded, his tone professional but stern. Emma couldn't move. Her Down syndrome meant that overwhelming situations often caused her to shut down completely. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. Her daughter's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her hands were flapping slightly at her sides, and she was making the soft humming sound that meant she was trying to self-regulate in the face of sensory overload. She's having a panic attack, Sarah shouted over the crowd. Still being held back by security personnel? Please, just give her a moment to calm down. But protocol demanded immediate action. The longer Emma remained in the restricted area, the more complicated the situation became. Other tourists were now taking photos and videos of the incident, and the ceremony was being disrupted. James watched from his position, every muscle in his body tense with the internal struggle between duty and compassion. He had seen Emma transform from a joyful, excited little girl into a frightened child having a panic attack, and he knew that the current approach was only making things worse. Sergeant Miller appeared at the edge of James's vision, his face stern as he assessed the situation. The sergeant's job was to maintain order and ensure that none of his guards broke protocol, no matter what was happening around them. Emma's panic attack was reaching its peak. She had begun rocking more violently, and tears were streaming down her face. The security officers, while well-meaning, had no training in dealing with individuals with special needs. Their standard procedures were designed for deliberate rule breakers, not for a frightened child with Down syndrome. Emma, sweetheart, can you hear Mama? Sarah called out desperately. Just take deep breaths, baby. You're okay. But Emma was too overwhelmed to process her mother's voice through all the other sounds and stimuli. She was lost in her own world of fear and confusion, unable to understand why everyone was shouting at her or how to make the situation stop. It was then that James made his decision, moving with the same precision he brought to all his military duties. James took one deliberate step forward, then another. The movement was so slight that most observers didn't notice it immediately, but it was a monumental breach of protocol for a Queen's Guard. Sergeant Miller's head snapped toward James immediately. Guard Wellington, return to position, he barked quietly, his voice barely audible, but carrying the full weight of military authority. James heard the order, but he didn't stop. He took another step toward Emma, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid startling her further. The crowd began to notice that one of the supposedly immovable guards was actually moving, and a hushed murmur rippled through the gathered tourists. Wellington. Sergeant Miller's voice was sharper now. But James continued walking toward the terrified little girl. When James was about 5 feet away from Emma, he stopped. Very slowly, he began to remove his bearskin hat, revealing a young face with kind eyes and a gentle expression. The action sent shockwaves through the crowd. Queen's Guards never removed their hats during duty, never showed their faces to the public during ceremonies. Emma noticed the movement and looked up through her tears. The tall, imposing figure she had been waving at was now at her eye level, having knelt down on one knee. His face was kind and calm, stark contrast to the stern voices that had been surrounding her. "Hello there," James said softly, his voice gentle and warm. It was the first time in 3 years of guard duty that he'd spoken to a tourist. "My name is James. What's your name?" Emma's rocking slowed slightly. She hiccuped through her tears and whispered, "Emma, that's a beautiful name," James said, maintaining the same calm tone. "Emma, I can see that you're feeling scared right now. That's okay. Sometimes grown-ups can be pretty loud, can't we?" The little girl nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Around them, the security situation was escalating as officers tried to figure out how to handle a Queen's Guard who had broken protocol to comfort a distressed child. "Are you really a guard?" Emma asked, her speech slightly slurred but her curiosity beginning to overcome her fear. "I am," James confirmed, setting his bearskin hat on the ground beside him. "And do you know what my job is?" Emma shook her head, her panic attack beginning to subside as she focused on James's calm presence. "My job is to protect people and make sure everyone feels safe," James explained. "And right now, I want to make sure you feel safe. Is that okay with you?" Emma nodded eagerly, her tears slowing. "I came from very far away to see you," she said proudly. "Did you really?" James asked, genuinely impressed. Where did you come from? America, Emma announced, her voice growing stronger. Mama saved lots of money so I could meet a real guard. James felt his heart squeeze. This little girl had traveled thousands of miles for this moment. And instead of the magical experience she had dreamed of, she had been frightened and overwhelmed. Well, then I'm very honored to meet you, Emma from America, James said formally, extending his hand for a handshake. Thank you for coming such a long way to visit us. Emma giggled and shook his hand enthusiastically. You're really nice, she said. I thought guards had to be serious all the time. We do have to be serious during our work, James explained. But we're still people underneath these uniforms. And sometimes being a person is more important than following all the rules. By now, Sergeant Miller had reached them, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. Protocol had been completely shattered. The ceremony was disrupted, and one of his guards was having an unauthorized conversation with a tourist in a restricted area. But as he approached, something made him pause. Emma was now smiling, her panic attack completely resolved. The crowd, instead of being upset by the disruption, seemed moved by what they were witnessing. Phones and cameras were recording every moment. But the mood was one of wonder rather than criticism. Sarah, finally allowed past the barriers, rushed to her daughter's side. She expected to find Emma traumatized by the experience, but instead found her chatting happily with the young guard who had risked his career to comfort her. Thank you, Sarah said to James, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much for helping her. She was so scared and you made it okay. James stood up slowly, the weight of what he had done beginning to settle on his shoulders. He had broken multiple regulations, defied direct orders, and created an international incident that was already being recorded and shared across social media. But, looking down at Emma's bright smile and hearing the genuine gratitude in her mother's voice, James knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes being human mattered more than following orders, and sometimes showing compassion was the highest form of duty. The consequences were yet to come, but in that moment, watching Emma's face light up with joy as she realized her dream had not only come true, but had become something even more special than she had imagined, James felt no regret whatsoever. The aftermath of James's decision rippled through the courtyard like stones thrown into still water. Tourists who had witnessed the interaction stood in amazed silence, many wiping away tears as they processed what they had just seen. The rigid, touchable mystique of the Queen's Guard had been broken by a simple act of human kindness. Sergeant Miller stood behind James, his military training warring with his personal reaction to the scene before him. In his 25 years of service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. Guards had been disciplined for far less serious breaches of protocol, but he had also never seen such a genuine moment of compassion that had so clearly been the right thing to do. Emma was now sitting cross-legged on the cobblestones next to James, chattering excitedly about her trip to London. Her panic attack was a distant memory, replaced by the pure joy of having a real conversation with her hero. And I learned all about your hats, Emma was saying, reaching out to touch James's bearskin hat that still lay on the ground beside them. They're made from real bear fur, but the bears weren't hurt just for hats. They died for other reasons first. James smiled, impressed by her knowledge. That's exactly right. You know a lot about us guards. I studied really hard, Emma said proudly. Mama got me books and videos. I know that you guard the Queen, and that you have to be very brave and very still. You certainly did your homework. James agreed. But can I tell you a secret? Emma's eyes widened with excitement. She leaned closer conspiratorially. Sometimes the bravest thing a guard can do is know when to move instead of staying still, James whispered. Emma considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important revelations. Like when you came to help me. Exactly like that. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, still processing the kindness this young soldier had shown. Emma, we should let James get back to his work now. He's been very kind to spend time with us. But Emma wasn't ready for the moment to end. Can I take a picture with you? She asked James hopefully. To show my friends at school. James hesitated. Taking photos with tourists was absolutely forbidden, and he had already broken enough rules for one day. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, he found himself nodding. "I think that would be nice," he said. Despite knowing that every photo would be evidence of his protocol violations, Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Hardly believing this was really happening, "Are you sure this is okay?" she asked James quietly. "I don't want to get you in trouble." James glanced at Sergeant Miller, who was now surrounded by other officers discussing the situation in hushed, urgent tones. "I'm probably already in trouble," James admitted. "But some things are more important than following every rule perfectly." As Sarah prepared to take the photo, something unexpected happened. The other guards in James's unit began to move. One by one, they stepped away from their positions and walked over to where James and Emma were sitting. Guard Thompson was the first to arrive. He had been watching the entire situation unfold and had been moved by both Emma's genuine excitement and James's compassion. Without saying a word, he removed his bearskin hat and knelt down beside James. "Hello," Emma Thompson said with a warm smile. "I'm Michael. I hear you've come a very long way to meet us." Emma's mouth fell open in amazement. Not only was she meeting one real guard, but now there were two. Guard Harrison arrived next, then Guard Davies. Within minutes, Emma was surrounded by 5 Queen's Guards, all of whom had abandoned their posts to spend time with the little girl who had dreamed of meeting them. Sergeant Miller watched in disbelief as his entire unit committed career suicide for the sake of one child's happiness. He should have been furious, should have been barking orders and restoring discipline immediately. Instead, he found himself thinking about his own daughter at home and how he would want someone to treat her if she were ever scared and alone in a foreign country. The crowd of tourists was now completely captivated by the scene. Instead of the formal, distant ceremony they had expected to witness, they were seeing something much more powerful, the human side of these legendary soldiers. Emma was in heaven. Each guard introduced himself and asked her questions about her trip, her interests, and her knowledge of their traditions. They were patient with her speech patterns and genuinely interested in what she had to say. "Do you know what the different colored plumes on our hats mean?" Guard Davies asked her. Emma nodded enthusiastically and began reciting the meanings she had memorized. The guards were impressed by her thoroughness and accuracy, praising her dedication to learning about their traditions. "You know more about our uniforms than some of the new recruits do." Thompson laughed. Sarah stood nearby, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter experience pure joy. She had worried so much about bringing Emma to London, concerned about how people would treat her, whether they would be patient with her differences, whether the trip would live up to Emma's enormous expectations. She had never imagined anything like this, ma'am. Sergeant Miller approached Sarah while the guards continued talking with Emma. His voice was formal, but not unkind. "I need you to understand that what's happening here is highly unusual. These men are violating direct orders and protocols that have been in place for centuries." Sarah's heart sank. She looked at her daughter, surrounded by kind young men who were treating her like the most important person in the world, and realized that their kindness might cost them their careers. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quickly. "If you need us to leave, if we're causing problems, we'll go right now. I never wanted anyone to get in trouble." Sergeant Miller studied her face, seeing the genuine concern and gratitude there. "They're not in trouble because of you or your daughter," he said quietly. "They're in trouble because they chose compassion over regulations. And honestly, ma'am, watching your little girl's face light up, ... I'm beginning to think they made the right choice." He paused, looking at his men who were now teaching Emma how to salute properly. "These are good soldiers," Miller continued. "They've served with honor and distinction. If they're willing to risk their careers for something, maybe it's worth paying attention to what that something is." Emma had mastered the salute and was demonstrating it proudly for each guard, who responded with their own crisp salutes in return. The formality of the military gesture, combined with the warmth and playfulness of the interaction, created something magical. "Besides," Sergeant Miller added with the hint of a smile, "the damage is already done. Half of London has probably seen videos of this by now. We might as well make sure it's a story worth telling. Sarah looked at him with hope and gratitude. You mean they won't be punished? Miller's expression grew more serious. I can't make promises about that. There will be consequences, and decisions above my pay grade will be made. But I can promise you that everyone who matters will hear about why this happened and what kind of men these are. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma broke away from the guards and ran to her mother and the sergeant. Mama, Sergeant Miller, she said excitedly, having heard someone use his rank. Look what they taught me. She demonstrated her perfect military salute, her face glowing with pride and accomplishment. Sergeant Miller found himself returning the salute with full military precision, treating Emma with the same respect he would show any fellow soldier. Outstanding form, Emma, he said seriously. You've clearly been well trained by some excellent soldiers. Emma beamed at the praise. And in that moment, Sergeant Miller understood exactly why his men had chosen to break protocol. Some rules existed to maintain order and tradition, but the higher purpose of their service was to protect and serve people, especially those who needed protection the most. The story was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for something remarkable. Within hours of Emma's encounter with the Queen's Guards, the story had traveled around the world. Videos taken by tourists showed the transformation from a frightened little girl having a panic attack to a joyful child, surrounded by kneeling soldiers who had abandoned their posts to comfort her. The footage was shared millions of times across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, and by evening, major television networks were reporting on the Buckingham Palace breakthrough, the moment when protocol gave way to humanity. James Wellington found himself at the center of an international sensation. His commanding officers had called an immediate meeting, and he sat in the sterile conference room facing a panel of high-ranking military officials whose expressions ranged from stern disapproval to barely concealed curiosity. Colonel Patricia Hensley, a career military officer with 30 years of service, led the inquiry. She had reviewed the footage, read witness statements, consulted with palace officials about the incident. Guard Wellington, she began, her voice crisp and professional. Are you aware of the seriousness of your actions today? Yes, ma'am, James replied, maintaining military posture despite the circumstances. You violated direct orders, abandoned your post, broke centuries of protocol, and created an international incident. Colonel Hensley continued. Do you have anything to say in your defense? James had spent hours preparing for this moment, thinking about how to explain his actions in military terms that his superiors would understand. But when the moment came, he found himself speaking from the heart instead of from strategy. Ma'am, I swore an oath to serve and protect, James said quietly. Today, I saw a frightened child who needed protection, and I served that need. I understand that I broke protocol, but I maintained my higher duty to my oath and to basic human decency. The room was silent for a long moment. Colonel Hensley studied James's face, looking for signs of defiance or disrespect. Instead, she saw a young soldier who had acted according to his conscience and was prepared to face the consequences. The palace has received over 50,000 messages about today's incident, Colonel Hensley said finally. Would you like to know what those messages say? James braced himself for criticism, complaints, and demands for his dismissal. 97% of them are positive, the colonel continued. People are calling you and your unit heroes. They're praising the Queen's Guards for showing that strength and compassion can coexist. The palace phone lines have been flooded with people wanting to donate to Down syndrome charities in Emma's name. James had blinked in surprise. He had expected public backlash, not support. Meanwhile, back at their hotel, Sarah and Emma were experiencing their own whirlwind. Emma had no understanding of social media or viral videos, but she understood that people were interested in her story with the guards. Mama, why do so many people want to talk to us? Emma asked as Sarah's phone rang for the 20th time that evening, because what happened today was very special. Sweetie, Sarah explained. Those guards were very kind to you, and people like hearing about kindness. Emma nodded thoughtfully. James said being kind was more important than rules sometimes. Sarah's heart swelled with pride. Her daughter, despite her intellectual disabilities, had grasped the essential truth of what had happened that day. A gentle knock on their hotel room door interrupted their conversation. Sarah opened it to find a well-dressed woman with an official badge. Mrs. Martinez. My name is Lady Catherine Pemberton. One represent Buckingham Palace. I was wondering if I might have a word with you and Emma. Sarah's stomach dropped. Had they done something wrong? Were they in trouble for Emma crossing the barrier? Lady Pemberton seemed to sense her concern. Please don't worry. You're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. The palace would like to extend a formal invitation. She entered the room and knelt down to Emma's level. Hello, Emma. I've heard wonderful things about you. How would you like to have tea with some very important people tomorrow? Emma's eyes widened. Real tea? Like princesses have? Exactly like princesses have, Lady Pemberton confirmed with a warm smile. Sarah was stunned. I don't understand. What kind of invitation? The incident today has created quite a stir, Lady Pemberton explained. But it's created the right kind of stir. The royal family believes that James and his fellow guards demonstrated the very best qualities of British service, courage, compassion, and putting humanity first. She sat down across from Sarah and Emma. Her Royal Highness would like to meet Emma personally and thank the guards publicly for their service. This isn't about damage control or public relations. This is about recognizing something genuinely beautiful that happened today. Emma was practically bouncing with excitement. Will I meet a real princess? You'll meet Princess Catherine, Lady Pemberton confirmed. She has a special interest in supporting individuals with special needs and their families. She was quite moved by your story. Sarah felt overwhelmed. The day had already been more than she could have dreamed. And now it was becoming something beyond her wildest imagination. What about the guards? Sarah asked. Are they in trouble? Lady Pemberton's expression grew more serious. That's complicated. Military discipline exists for important reasons, and what they did was unprecedented. But the palace has made its position clear. Those young men exemplified the highest ideals of service today, back at the military base. The 5 guards sat together in their barracks, still processing what had happened. They had all submitted written statements about their actions and were waiting to learn their fate. Do you regret it? Thompson asked James. James thought about Emma's smile, her perfect salute, the pure joy on her face when she realized that her heroes were treating her as their equal. Not for a second, James replied. Even if they discharge all of us tomorrow, it was worth it. Harrison nodded in agreement. I've been a guard for 4 years. I've never felt better about wearing this uniform than I did today. My sister has autism, Davies added quietly. I know what it's like when the world isn't built for someone you love. What we did today, ... It mattered. Their conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Miller entering the barracks. His expression was unreadable, and the guards stood at attention, prepared for the worst. At ease, Miller said. I have news. He paused, looking at each of his men in turn. You're all being reassigned, he announced. The guards exchanged glances, their hearts sinking. Reassignment usually meant punishment, demotion, or being moved to less prestigious positions. You're being assigned to a new protocol unit, Miller continued. The palace is creating a special division focused on community engagement and public relations. Your job will be to represent the crown at charity events, hospital visits, and community outreach programs. The men stared at him in shock. It turns out, Miller said with a small smile, that the royal family has decided that guards who know when to break protocol in service of a higher calling are exactly the kind of soldiers they want representing them. James felt his legs go weak with relief. We're not being discharged? Quite the opposite, Miller replied. You're being promoted. All of you. The incident report states that you demonstrated exceptional judgment, compassion, and the true spirit of service under unprecedented circumstances. He handed James an official document. You have new orders, effective immediately. Tomorrow, you'll be escorting Emma Martinez and her mother to tea with Princess Catherine. Consider it your first assignment in your new roles. The barracks erupted in celebration. But James found himself thinking about Emma. She had no idea that her simple act of waving at a guard had changed not just her own life, but the lives of 5 soldiers and the very nature of how the Queen's Guard engaged with the public the next morning. Emma woke up convinced that the previous day had been the most wonderful dream of her life. When her mother showed her the official invitation to tea at the palace, written on cream-colored paper with gold edges, Emma finally understood that it had all been real. "Mama," she said seriously, "I think James was right about being kind, being more important than rules." Sarah hugged her daughter close. "Yes, sweetheart. I think he was absolutely right." As they prepared for their royal tea, neither of them could have imagined how much more their story had yet to unfold. The guards had been saved, the palace had embraced the incident as a positive moment, and Emma had become an unwitting symbol of how a little kindness could change everything. But the most important part of the story was still to come, the moment when a little girl's dream would come full circle, and the guards who had risked everything for her would discover that sometimes the greatest rewards come from the smallest acts of courage. The morning of Emma's royal tea arrived with London's typical autumn drizzle, but nothing could dampen the excitement radiating from the young girl as she put on her finest dress, a blue velvet outfit that her grandmother had bought specifically for special occasions. Sarah had barely slept, overwhelmed by the surreal turn their vacation had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been a worried mother trying to give her daughter a memorable trip to London. Now, they were preparing to have tea with royalty because of a moment of human kindness that had touched the world. An official palace car arrived at their hotel precisely at 2 o'clock. The driver, impeccably dressed and extraordinarily polite, helped Emma into the vehicle with the same care he would show any VIP. "Are we really going to see a princess?" Emma asked for the 100th time as they drove through London's streets toward Buckingham Palace. "We really are, sweetheart," Sarah confirmed, still hardly believing it herself. Emma pressed her face against the car window, watching the familiar landmarks pass by. Everything looked different now, more magical. More important, because she was seeing it as someone who belonged in this world, not just as a tourist looking from the outside. At the same time, James and his 4 fellow guards were preparing for their own transformation. They stood in a different uniform today, still formal and military, but designed for special occasions rather than sentry duty. Their new roles as community engagement officers required a different kind of presentation. "I still can't believe this is really happening," Thompson said as he adjusted his tie. 24 hours ago, we thought our careers were over. Sometimes doing the right thing leads to consequences you never expected, James replied. Both good and bad ones. Sergeant Miller appeared in the doorway of their preparation room. "Gentlemen, your escort is here. Princess Catherine is ready to meet her guests." As they walked through the palace corridors, James felt the weight of history around them. These walls had witnessed centuries of important moments, state visits, and royal ceremonies. But today felt different, more personal, more meaningful than any formal protocol. They arrived at the blue drawing room, where Princess Catherine was waiting. She was exactly as Emma had imagined, elegant, warm, and genuinely interested in meeting her young guest. Emma entered the room, holding tightly to her mother's hand, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the ornate furnishings, oil paintings, and crystal chandeliers. But when she saw Princess Catherine, she forgot all about the grandeur of the surroundings. "Your Royal Highness," Emma said carefully, attempting the curtsy that her mother had practiced with her that morning. It wasn't perfect, but it was executed with such earnest concentration that everyone in the room was charmed. "Hello, Emma," Princess Catherine replied, kneeling down to Emma's level. "I'm so pleased to meet you. I've heard wonderful things about your adventure yesterday." Emma's face lit up with recognition and excitement. "You're really a princess, like in my books." Princess Catherine laughed warmly. "I am, though I spend most of my time working, rather than wearing crowns and living in fairy tales. But I do get to live in some beautiful places and meet amazing people like you." The tea service was set up in an intimate corner of the room, with child-sized portions and Emma's favorite treats, information the palace staff had somehow obtained and prepared for. Emma was delighted to discover cucumber sandwiches, scones with jam, and tiny cakes decorated with edible flowers. "Emma," Princess Catherine said as they settled in for tea, "I wanted to meet you because something very special happened yesterday. Do you know what made it so special?" Emma thought carefully, her brow furrowed with concentration. "James and his friends were very nice to me when I was scared." "That's exactly right," Princess Catherine confirmed. "But do you know why that was so important?" Emma shook her head. "Genuinely curious. Because they showed everyone watching that kindness is more powerful than rules," the princess explained. "They've reminded all of us that taking care of each other is the most important job any of us has, whether we're guards or princesses or anyone else." As they talked, James and his fellow guards stood at respectful attention nearby. Princess Catherine noticed them and gestured for them to join the conversation. "James," she said, addressing him directly, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did yesterday. It took tremendous courage to choose compassion over protocol." James stepped forward. "Your Royal Highness, I was simply doing what felt right in the moment." Emma needed help, and helping her seemed more important than following regulations. "That's precisely what makes it so remarkable," Princess Catherine replied. "True service isn't about blindly following rules. It's about understanding when the spirit of those rules requires you to act with wisdom and humanity." She turned back to Emma, who was carefully balancing a scone with jam and cream. "Emma, did you know that what happened yesterday has inspired people all over the world?" Emma looked up from her scone, confused. "It has. People have seen the videos of James and his friends being kind to you, and it's reminded them to be kind to others too. Hospitals have reported more volunteers, charities are receiving more donations, and parents are using your story to teach their children about treating everyone with respect." Emma considered this information with the serious thoughtfulness that children bring to important concepts. "So being nice to me helped other people too?" "Exactly," Princess Catherine confirmed. "Your story shows that one moment of kindness can spread like ripples in a pond, touching people you'll never even meet." Sarah watched her daughter process this information, felt her heart swell with pride. Emma might face challenges that other children didn't, but she was teaching the world something vital about the power of simple human connection. "I have something for you." "Emma," Princess Catherine said, producing a beautiful wooden box. "This is a special gift from the royal family." Emma opened the box carefully to find a custom-made pin featuring the Queen's Guard emblem alongside a heart symbol. It was designed specifically for her, acknowledging both her love of the Guards and the love they had shown her. "This makes you an honorary friend of the Queen's Guard," Princess Catherine explained. "It means that you'll always be part of our family here in London." Emma's eyes filled with tears of joy as she held the pin carefully. "Can I show James?" "Of course you can." Emma ran to James, holding up the pin proudly. "Look, I'm a real guard friend now." James knelt down to examine the pin, his own eyes misting. "That's the most beautiful guard pin I've ever seen," he said solemnly. "You should wear it with pride." As Emma carefully pinned her new badge to her dress, Princess Catherine addressed the guards collectively. "Your actions yesterday reminded all of us what the monarchy truly stands for," she said. "Not rigid tradition for its own sake, but service, compassion, and putting the welfare of others first. Your new roles will allow you to continue demonstrating these values in communities across Britain." She paused. Looking at each of them in turn, "You've shown that true strength lies not in never bending, but in knowing when flexibility serves a higher purpose. The Crown is proud to have you in service, and I personally am grateful for the example you've set." As the formal tea concluded, Emma approached Princess Catherine with one final request. "Can I give you a hug?" she asked shyly. Princess Catherine smiled warmly. "I would be honored." The embrace between the princess and the little girl with Down syndrome was captured by the official palace photographer, but it was much more than a photo opportunity. It was a moment of genuine affection between two people who had found common ground in their shared belief in kindness, in human dignity. As they prepared to leave, Emma turned back to the guards one more time. "Thank you for being my friends," she said simply. "You made my dream come true." But as James watched Emma wave goodbye, he realized that she had it backwards. She had made their dreams come true by showing them what service really meant and giving them the courage to choose compassion over conformity. The story was nearing its end, but its impact was just beginning. 6 months later, Emma Martinez sat in her classroom in Phoenix, Arizona, wearing her special Queen's Guard pin and sharing her story with her classmates for what seemed like the 100th time. But she never grew tired of telling it. Her audience never grew tired of hearing about the day she met real guards and a real princess. And then James knelt down and talked to me when I was scared. Emma was explaining to a new student who had just joined their class. He broke the rules because being kind was more important. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, smiled as she listened. Emma's story had become a cornerstone of their classroom discussions about empathy, courage, and treating others with respect. The little girl who had once been nervous about how others would accept her differences now stood confidently before her peers, teaching them about compassion and human connection. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, James Wellington was visiting a children's hospital in Manchester as part of his new role with the Queen's Guard Community Engagement Unit. He wore his dress uniform with pride, but it was the same pin that Emma had received, the one designating him as part of their special bond that meant the most to him. "Are you really one of the guards who helped that little girl?" asked 7-year-old Marcus, patient in the hospital's pediatric ward, who had been following the story since it first made news. "I am," James confirmed, sitting down beside Marcus's bed. "Her name is Emma, and she's one of the bravest people I've ever met." "Braver than a soldier?" Marcus asked skeptically. "Much braver," James said seriously. "She traveled thousands of miles to chase her dream, and when things got scary, she didn't give up. She taught me and my friends that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is just be yourself and treat others with kindness." The Community Engagement Unit had become one of the most requested and beloved aspects of the Queen's Guard. James and his colleagues visited schools, hospitals, community centers, and charity events throughout Britain. Bringing the same warmth and humanity that had made Emma's story so powerful, they had discovered that their military training, combined with their newfound understanding of when to break protocol in service of human connection, made them uniquely effective at reaching people who felt overlooked or marginalized by society. Thompson had become an advocate for autism awareness after his experiences with Emma reminded him of his own sister's struggles. Davies worked extensively with military families, helping children cope with deployment and separation. Harrison focused on anti-bullying programs in schools, using the story of how Emma's differences had been celebrated rather than mocked as a teaching tool. But perhaps the most remarkable change had been in the Queen's Guard tradition itself. The rigid, touchable mystique that had defined the Guards for centuries had evolved into something more nuanced and human. Guards were now trained not just in military protocol, but in recognizing situations where compassion should override procedure. They learned about different disabilities, cultural sensitivities, and how to interact appropriately with children and vulnerable individuals. The ATHMET protocol, as it came to be known unofficially, gave guards permission to use their judgment in determining when human needs superseded ceremonial requirements. It didn't happen often, but when it did, the public response was overwhelmingly positive. Sarah Martinez often received updates about the impact Emma's story continued to have. Donations to Down syndrome organizations had increased by 300% in the months following the incident. Support groups for parents of children with special needs reported record membership. Most importantly, people around the world shared stories of how Emma's experience had inspired them to show greater kindness and patience in their own communities. Emma herself remained largely unaware of her global influence. To her, the story was simply about the day she met some very nice soldiers and a beautiful princess who gave her tea and a special pin. But the lessons she had learned that day continued to shape her approach to life. When classmates were unkind to others, Emma would gently remind them about the importance of being nice. When she encountered new situations that might have once frightened her, she remembered how James had helped her feel safe and tried to be equally brave. On the first anniversary of their meeting, Emma received a special video message from James and his fellow guards. They were standing in front of Buckingham Palace, all wearing their pins that matched hers, recording their message during a break in their duties. "Hello, Emma," James said, smiling directly into the camera. "It's been exactly 1 year since we met, and we wanted you to know that we think about that day all the time." Thompson stepped forward. "You've changed our lives, Emma. You've taught us what it really means to serve others. You showed us that rules are important. But people are more important," Davies added, "and you proved that one person, no matter how small, can make the whole world a little bit kinder," Harrison concluded. James appeared on screen again. "We hope you're still wearing your pin and remembering that you're an honorary member of the Queen's Guard. But more than that, we hope you know that you're a teacher, a leader, and an inspiration to people everywhere." The video ended with all 5 guards giving Emma a formal military salute, the same gesture of respect they would show to any fellow soldier or member of royalty. Emma watched the video dozens of times, each viewing filling her with the same joy and pride she had felt that magical day in London. But what she treasured most was the knowledge that the kindness she had experienced was continuing to spread, touching lives she would never know about in ways she could never imagine, her mother often found. Emma looking at the photos from their trip, images of her surrounded by kneeling guards, shaking hands with Princess Catherine, wearing her special pin with unmistakable pride. In each photo, Emma's face glowed with the kind of pure happiness that comes from being seen, valued, and loved exactly as you are. The story of Emma. Martinez and the Queen's Guards had become more than just a viral moment or a feel-good news story. It had become a reminder that in a world often divided by differences, common humanity could bridge any gap. It proved that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the smallest gestures, that courage could look like breaking rules for the right reasons, and that a little girl with Down syndrome could teach the world's most disciplined soldiers what true service really meant. Years later, when Emma would tell her story to her own children, she would always end it the same way. "And that's how I learned that being different isn't something to hide from, and that the best people are the ones who choose to be kind when no one is making them do it." The guards thought they were protecting Emma that day. But in reality, she had protected something far more precious, their capacity for compassion, their willingness to put humanity before protocol, and their understanding that sometimes the most important barriers to cross are the ones that separate us from each. In a world that often seemed to celebrate division and difference, Emma's story remained a beacon of hope, proof that kindness was contagious, that understanding could triumph over fear, and that one moment of genuine human connection could ripple outward to touch millions of lives. The little girl who had once been afraid to cross a simple barrier had ended up breaking down walls that were far more significant, creating a legacy of compassion that would continue long after her story faded from the headlines. And in the end, that was the most royal achievement of all.